I told myself it was just a visit to reconnect, to surprise my son and spend time together. But nothing could have prepared me for the feelings that surfaced, the stolen glances, the lingering touches, the tension that refused to fade. What started as a mother's love turned into something far more complicated and dangerous. And now, I can't stop wondering, was it all a mistake, or was it meant to happen? Laura always prided herself on being a loving and supportive mother. At 41, she had devoted her life to raising her son, Ethan, and watching him grow into a confident and independent young man. Her marriage had ended years ago, leaving her to raise Ethan on her own. Despite the struggles, they had always shared a close bond, a bond she thought was unshakable. When Ethan moved out and settled in a remote ski village to start his new job, Laura couldn't help but feel both pride and sadness. She missed him deeply, but she told herself it was time to let go, to give him space to grow. Still, as the weeks passed, the loneliness began to gnaw at her. It wasn't just Ethan's absence that left a void in her life. Laura had spent so many years being a mother, a caretaker, and a provider that she forgot who she was outside of those roles. Her social life had faded, and any spark of romance had long since died. Nights were spent alone, surrounded by silence, and mornings felt empty without the chaos of raising a child. So, when she decided to visit Ethan unannounced, it felt like more than just a casual trip. It felt like a chance to reconnect, not just with her son, but with herself. Arriving at his chalet, Laura was overwhelmed by the beauty and serenity of the snow-covered mountains. The house smelled of cedar and firewood, warm and inviting. But it was seeing Ethan that truly caught her off guard. He wasn't the boy she remembered. He was taller, broader, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that felt foreign yet familiar. His smile lit up the room, and for a brief moment, Laura felt something stir inside her. A flicker of pride mixed with an ache she couldn't quite name. As the evening unfolded, Laura couldn't help but notice the closeness between them. The way he looked at her with admiration, the way his voice softened when he spoke. She told herself it was just motherly affection, but deep down, something about the way he made her feel unsettled her. And as night fell, the walls of the chalet seemed to close in, trapping them in a space where boundaries began to blur. Laura tried to convince herself that everything was normal. She was just visiting her son, sharing stories, and catching up on his life. But as the hours turned into days, the tension between them grew harder to ignore. It started with the little things. The way Ethan's eyes lingered on her a second too long, the way his touch seemed to last just a moment more than necessary. At first, Laura brushed it off as her imagination. He was her son, after all. But the more time they spent together, the harder it became to dismiss. One evening, Laura stepped out of the shower, wrapping herself in a towel as steam filled the small guest bathroom. She wiped the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her skin was still flushed from the heat, and for the first time in years she noticed herself, the curve of her shoulders, the softness of her lips. She suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that startled her. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart jump. She quickly tightened her towel and opened the door, stepping into the dimly lit room. "Mom!" Ethan's voice startled her. He was standing just outside the doorway, his eyes flickering downward before quickly meeting hers. I just wanted to see if you needed anything," he said, his voice uneven. Laura felt her breath catch. Was it guilt in his eyes? Or something else? "No, I'm fine," she said, pulling the towel tighter around her body. "I was just about to get dressed." "Right," Ethan said, stepping back but not before their eyes met again, and Laura felt a heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the shower. The moment passed quickly, but it lingered in Laura's thoughts long after. She told herself she was overthinking it, that Ethan's gaze had been nothing more than innocent curiosity. But deep down, doubt began to creep in. Over the next few days, Laura found herself more aware of Ethan. How his presence filled the room, how his laugh made her stomach flutter in a way that left her confused. She tried to dismiss it, to blame the isolation of the chalet or the intimacy of being alone together, but it wasn't enough to quiet the questions in her mind. One night, unable to sleep, Laura wandered downstairs to find Ethan sitting by the fire. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head, taking a seat on the couch. "You." "Same." They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Then Ethan turned to her, his eyes searching hers. It's been really nice having you here," he said softly. Laura smiled, but her heart raced. "It's been nice for me too." Ethan hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but instead, he reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. Laura froze. The touch was soft, lingering just long enough to make her pulse quicken. Ethan. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if realizing his mistake. Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, it's okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't okay. At least, not in the way it should have been. Laura stood abruptly, her hands trembling. I should get to bed, she said, avoiding his gaze. Ethan nodded, but his expression told her he felt it too, whatever this was. As Laura climbed the stairs to her room, her mind raced. She told herself it was just a moment of weakness, an innocent slip. But the truth gnawed at her. Something had shifted between them. Something dangerous. And she didn't know how to stop it. Laura tried to bury the thoughts that haunted her since that night by the fire. She kept busy, helping Ethan with chores, exploring the village, and pretending nothing had changed. But the tension hung between them, heavy and unspoken, like a thread stretched too tightly, ready to snap. The problem was the way Ethan looked at her now, like she wasn't just his mother but something more. And worse, Laura couldn't stop herself from noticing him too. One evening, Ethan suggested they watch a movie. Laura agreed, thinking it might help distract her from the storm brewing inside her. She curled up at one end of the couch while Ethan sat at the other. But as the movie played, she couldn't focus. Her thoughts drifted, and her awareness of his presence grew sharper. She noticed the way his arm rested along the back of the couch, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed it. The warmth radiating off his body seemed to seep into her skin, leaving her breath shallow and uneven. At one point, their hands accidentally touched as they reached for the remote. Laura pulled away quickly, but Ethan didn't move. Instead, he let his fingers linger on the cushion, just inches from hers. She should have gotten up, ended the night right then. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed. When the credits rolled, Laura stood to collect the empty glasses from the coffee table. But before she could take a step, Ethan reached out and gently took her wrist. Mom, he said softly, his voice low and uncertain. She froze, the glass trembling in her hand. Ethan, we can't. I know, he interrupted, his grip loosening but not letting go. But why does it feel like we already have? His words hit her like a punch to the chest. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things. But the truth was she had felt it too. The shift, the longing neither of them wanted to admit. Before she could respond, Ethan stood, closing the distance between them. Tell me to stop, he whispered. Laura opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, her breath hitched as Ethan's fingers brushed against her cheek, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Ethan, this is wrong, she finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. Then tell me to stop, he repeated, his voice almost pleading. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned in, just enough for her lips to graze his. The kiss was hesitant at first, as if testing the boundaries they both knew they were crossing. But when Ethan didn't pull away, Laura gave in completely. Her hands found his shoulders, and his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. The world outside the chalet disappeared. All that mattered was the heat of his touch, the way his lips moved against hers, and the thrill that coursed through her veins. But then, as quickly as it started, reality came crashing back. Laura pulled away, her chest heaving as she stepped back. No, we can't do this, she said, her voice trembling. Ethan looked at her, his expression torn between regret and longing. Mom. No, she interrupted. This can't happen again. It shouldn't have happened at all. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes as she turned and fled to her room, locking the door behind her. But even as she sank onto the bed, her heart pounding and her thoughts racing, Laura couldn't erase the feel of his lips, the weight of his hands, or the fire that had ignited inside her. She spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over, torn between guilt and desire. The next morning, Laura avoided Ethan entirely, staying in her room under the pretense of being tired. But by the afternoon, she knew she couldn't hide forever. When she finally came downstairs, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up when he saw her, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and desperation. Mom, we need to talk. No, we don't, Laura said quickly, her voice sharp as she grabbed her coat. I'm going out for a walk. Ethan stood, blocking her path. You can't just pretend this didn't happen. That's exactly what I'm going to do, she snapped, brushing past him and stepping out into the cold. But even as the icy air stung her cheeks, Laura couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he looked at her. About the way she wanted him to look at her again. Laura didn't know how long she wandered through the snow-covered streets of the village. The cold air burned her lungs, but it couldn't drown out the heat that lingered from the night before. No matter how far she walked, she couldn't escape it. The feel of Ethan's lips, the weight of his hands, the fire that ignited inside her the moment she gave in. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't have to look to know it was Ethan. She ignored it. By the time she returned to the chalet, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. The house was quiet, but she could feel Ethan's presence before she even saw him. He was sitting by the fire again, staring into the flames. He looked up when she entered, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You didn't answer your phone," he said softly. Laura avoided his gaze. "I needed time to think." And she didn't answer. Instead, she busied herself hanging up her coat, her hands trembling. "Mom!" Her breath caught at the sound of his voice. She turned slowly, bracing herself for the look she knew she'd find. The desperation, the longing, and the guilt mirrored in her own heart. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen," he said, standing and closing the distance between them. "We have to," Laura whispered, but the words sounded hollow. "Why?" Ethan's voice broke. "Why are we acting like this wasn't real? Like it didn't mean something?" "It can't mean anything," Laura said, her voice sharp. "You're my son." His expression darkened. "I'm not a child anymore, Mom." The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Laura's heart pounded as Ethan stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You felt it too," he continued, his voice softer now. "I know you did." "Stop," Laura pleaded, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. I understand more than you think." Before she could stop him, Ethan reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek. The touch sent a shiver through her, and she hated herself for leaning into it. "Ethan, tell me you don't feel it," he whispered. "Tell me you don't want this." Laura opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She couldn't lie, not to him and not to herself. Ethan's lips brushed against hers, hesitant at first, but when she didn't pull away, the kiss deepened. Laura's defenses crumbled as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer. For a moment, nothing else existed. The world outside the chalet disappeared, and all that mattered was the fire burning between them. But then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Laura pulled away, her heart racing as panic set in. "Who is that?" she whispered. Before Ethan could answer, a familiar voice echoed through the house. "Laura? Ethan?" It was Dean. Laura froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. She hadn't expected her ex-husband to visit. Not now, not after everything that had happened. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice laced with panic. "Go to your room," she hissed, pushing him away. "Now." Ethan hesitated, but one look at her face sent him retreating upstairs. Laura barely had time to compose herself before Dean appeared in the living room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The flushed cheeks, the trembling hands, the tension that still lingered in the air. "Laura," he said, his voice sharp. "What's going on?" "Nothing," she replied quickly. "You just surprised me, that's all." Dean's eyes flickered toward the staircase. "Where's Ethan?" "He's upstairs," Laura said, forcing a smile. "We were just watching a movie." Dean didn't look convinced. "You're acting strange." "I'm fine," she snapped, but her voice betrayed her. Dean's gaze hardened. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Laura's heart pounded as panic gripped her. She couldn't let him find out. She couldn't let everything fall apart. But before she could respond, Ethan's footsteps echoed down the stairs. "Dad!" Dean turned, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on here, Ethan?" "Nothing," Ethan said quickly, but Dean wasn't buying it. "I know when I'm being lied to," Dean said, his voice rising. "What the hell is going on between you two?" Laura's breath caught as Ethan looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to say something, to protect them. But she couldn't. Dean's expression shifted as realization hit him. "Oh my God," he whispered, stepping back as if he'd been struck. "You've got to be kidding me." "Dean, don't." His voice was sharp, cutting through her like a knife. "Don't you dare try to explain this." "It's not what you think," Laura pleaded, but Dean's eyes blazed with anger. "It's exactly what I think," he spat. "How could you? How could either of you?" Ethan stepped forward, but Dean raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Stay away from me," he warned. "Both of you." Laura's knees buckled as Dean stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Ethan moved to comfort her, but she pushed him away. "This is over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mom." "No," she looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "Whatever this was, it's done." But as Ethan's eyes met hers, Laura knew the truth. It wasn't over. Laura sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the door Ethan had just walked through. Her heart pounded, her breathing shallow as the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her. Dean's face, the look of betrayal and disgust, was burned into her memory. She wanted to cry, scream, or run, but all she could do was sit there, frozen in the aftermath. Her phone buzzed. A text. It was Dean. "I can't believe you. Don't contact me again." Laura dropped the phone onto the bed, her hands trembling. She'd destroyed everything. The fragile co-parenting relationship she'd managed to maintain with Dean, the trust her family had once held, and her own sense of self-respect. The guilt was suffocating. She could still feel Ethan's touch, his lips, the heat that had consumed her. And that made it worse. Because despite the shame, part of her didn't regret it. Ethan had crossed a line, yes, but she had let him. She had wanted it, wanted to feel alive, wanted to be seen in a way she hadn't been for years. But now, the fire that had burned so brightly had left nothing but ash in its wake. A soft knock broke through her thoughts. "Mom!" Laura's heart sank. She couldn't face him. Not now. "Go to bed, Ethan," she said, her voice hollow. "Please, we need to talk." "No, we don't." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to sound firm. "Just go." The silence stretched on before she finally heard his footsteps retreat. Laura buried her face in her hands. She knew pushing him away wouldn't fix what had happened. But what choice did she have? The next morning, Laura found Ethan in the kitchen. He was already dressed, sipping coffee as he stared out the window. The tension in the air was unbearable. "I think it's best if I leave today," Laura said softly, breaking the silence. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to go." "Yes, I do." He set down his coffee. "You're running away." "I'm protecting us." "From what?" "From how we feel." Laura's chest tightened. "This isn't about feelings, Ethan. It's about what's right and wrong." "And what we did was wrong?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes." The word hung between them like a blade. Ethan flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You can lie to yourself if that makes it easier," he said softly. "But don't lie to me." Laura's breath hitched. "Ethan, this has to stop." "I don't want it to." "Don't you understand what's at stake?" Her voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. "We can't take this back. It's already ruined everything." "Then let it ruin me," he said, his voice raw. "Because I don't care." Laura turned away, wiping at her tears. "You should care. You're young, Ethan. You still have your whole life ahead of you. You can't let this define you." "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you have left?" The question hit harder than she expected. Because the truth was, Laura didn't know. She had spent so long being a mother, a wife, a caretaker, that she had lost herself along the way. And now, standing here, stripped of the illusion of control, she didn't know who she was anymore. "I need time," she whispered. Ethan nodded, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. "And what if time doesn't change how we feel?" Laura didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the questions she couldn't face. The drive home felt endless. Laura gripped the steering wheel, replaying everything over and over in her mind. By the time she reached her empty house, she felt hollow. She wandered through the rooms, each one a reminder of the life she'd built, and the life she'd just destroyed. For days, Laura avoided her phone. She didn't call Dean. She didn't text Ethan. She needed space, time to process the chaos she had unleashed. But space didn't help. Every night, she lay awake, haunted by the memory of Ethan's touch. And every morning, she woke up feeling more broken than the day before. A week later, her phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "I miss you." Laura stared at the message, her heart racing. She wanted to respond, to tell him she missed him too. But instead, she deleted the text. Because no matter how much she wanted him, she knew they could never go back. Laura sat in the dim glow of her living room, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, and the weight of silence pressing down on her. It had been 2 weeks since she left the chalet, 2 weeks since she last saw Ethan. But the memories hadn't faded, they lingered, vivid and inescapable. She had tried to busy herself with work, errands, and long walks through the neighborhood. But no amount of distraction could erase the echoes of Ethan's voice, the warmth of his touch, or the longing that had ignited inside her. The guilt was suffocating. She replayed the night over and over, searching for the moment she should have stopped it, the point where she could have turned away. But the truth was harder to face. She hadn't wanted to stop. It wasn't just Ethan. It was what he made her feel, desired, alive, wanted in a way she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had been the responsible one, the caretaker who put everyone else's needs first. And somewhere along the way, she lost herself. That was the hardest part to admit. It wasn't just about what happened with Ethan. It was about the emptiness that had existed long before he stepped back into her life. Laura knew she couldn't stay trapped in this spiral of guilt and regret. She needed to face it, to understand why it happened and what it said about her. The next day, Laura called a therapist. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew she couldn't do this alone. She poured out her story, the loneliness, the confusion, the shame, and for the first time she felt heard. "It's not just about what you did," the therapist said gently. "It's about why you let yourself get to that point. You need to forgive yourself, not for what happened, but for not taking care of your own needs before it came to this. Forgive herself." The words felt impossible. But as the days turned into weeks, Laura began to understand what they meant. She focused on rebuilding, reconnecting with old friends, starting a yoga class, and even picking up hobbies she'd long forgotten. For the first time in years, she started living for herself, not for anyone else. But there was still Ethan. He texted a few times, each message a reminder of the bond they'd shared and the line they had crossed. She didn't respond, though it hurt more than she wanted to admit. One evening, after another therapy session, she finally wrote back, "Ethan, I love you. But we need to move on, for both of us." His reply came quickly. "I understand. I just want you to be happy." Tears filled her eyes as she read his words. It wasn't closure, but it was enough to start letting go. Months later, Laura stood by the window, sipping tea as the snow fell outside. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened, turning into something she could live with. She thought about Ethan sometimes, wondering how he was doing, if he'd found peace, or if he still thought about her too. But she resisted the urge to reach out, because some wounds needed time to heal. Laura had learned the hardest lesson of all. Desire could be intoxicating, but it was no substitute for love, security, or self-worth. Her choices had consequences, but they had also forced her to confront the parts of herself she had ignored for far too long. As the snow continued to fall, Laura allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that chalet weeks ago. She was stronger now, more aware of her boundaries and her worth. And while the past couldn't be erased, it didn't have to define her future. What would you have done if you were in Laura's position? Could you resist the temptation, or would you give in to the forbidden? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm dying to know what you think. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more shocking and emotional stories. Trust me, the next one is even more intense.